Great that everybody can join us for this webinar on communicating climate action in Cumbria. My name's Karen Mitchell. I'm the chair of the an hour and a half that we have today to talk about this great topic. I'm the chief exec of Cumbria Action for Sustainability, and I'm also the co-chair alongside Dr. David Murphy of the University of Cumbria. I'm the co-chair of the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership. And this webinar is being brought to you by the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership with the help of funding from the National Lottery Climate Action Fund. Back to Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership, I expect many of you are familiar with it. It's an initiative involving many diverse organisations from the public, private and third sectors across Cumbria, all working together to plan and put in action the pathway to net zero carbon emissions for Cumbria by 2037. If you haven't heard of ZCCP, I thoroughly recommend that you visit our website. If you Google Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership, you will come across it. We're very proud of it. It's an award-winning website, so there's lots of information there should you need it. I mentioned 2037 as our target for net zero carbon. It is ambitious. It's an ambitious target. It requires rapid and radical action from individuals, communities, and organisations across Cumbria. And communication is absolutely key to that action. Communication can unlock understanding, it can give hope, it can inspire change, it can highlight success, but it can also scare, polarize, and misinform. So we need all the help we can get to get it right. And that includes understanding our audiences. I always keep in mind that communication isn't just what's said, it's also what's heard. And different audiences will respond differently to perhaps the same message. So hence this webinar, which draws on work by Climate Outreach and the Centre for Sustainable Energy to really help us understand audiences and messaging. And it gives us the chance to explore how we might apply their approaches in Cumbria. So we're going to start with Louisa Mello, who's a researcher at Climate Outreach, who's going to give us the overview of the Britain Talks Climate Toolkit. And then we'll hear from Bridget Newbury from the Centre for Sustainable Energy, who've done some work applying that data and mapping the segmentation of audiences specifically in Cumbria. And we'll look at some examples and case studies. As you'll see, we've built in time for Q&As for both those sessions. If, as you're listening to the presentations, questions come to you, please do share them in the chat, and we will run through as many of those questions as we can get through after each speaker. And if there are any questions unanswered, we will follow up after the webinar and share the answers to those. I'm not going to talk any further. I'm going to hand over now to Louisa to start us off. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Karen. And yes, hello to everyone from me as well. Like Karen said, I'm Louisa Mello, a researcher at Climate Outreach. Now, for those of you who don't know, which will probably be a few, Climate Outreach is a non-profit organization. We are based in Oxford, and we're made up by a team of about 20 social scientists and communication specialists. Our approach is to place people with their values and their experiences at the heart of public engagement on climate change in order to build a social mandate that is necessary to transform our societies. We see our role as a catalyzer of best practice and understanding of public engagement on climate change. And as such, we're working to rewrite the climate story in a way that is positive, that places people at the center of it, and that is motivating for those who hear it. We do research sort of practically, and then produce evidence-based practical guidance for driving public engagement with climate change. And that can be in the form of guides and toolkits, trainings and workshops. We also do some bespoke support and advice for organizations, and also have some longer partnerships and do some advocacy, mainly in the UK, but also internationally. Great. Right, so then let's get right to it. What is Britain Talks Climate? Yes, it's an online toolkit for engaging the British public on climate change. It was first published by us in 2020 and came out of a collaboration with Climate Outreach, more in common, the European Climate Foundation and YouGov. And it was developed based on rigorous research that took place initially in 2020, but since then we've continuously updated the online toolkit on the Climate Outreach website with new research insights, more recommendations, do's and don'ts around climate comms. And we've recently had a big update in 2024 that we released just in April. Now, what makes Britain Talks Climate unique as a toolkit? Well, first of all, it's values-based, and it's about understanding people's values and worldviews and how to talk about climate change. So we try to build narratives on climate change that resonate with diverse people and with everyday concerns in order to, really get to that kind of long-term goal of deepening and broadening public engagement on climate change. And Britain Talks Climate wants to get at what people actually think and feel about the world and how climate fits into that. So it provides a realistic understanding of how climate actually competes with or crops up in the narratives that really drive our everyday lives and drive politics as well. Crucially, Britain Talks Climate uses the 7 British segments as a lens through which to think about how different people in Britain relate to climate action. And we will now just watch a short video that briefly introduces all the 7 British segments.
We're often told that Britain is divided.
Can you, and we've got subtitles, lovely.
To account. But after speaking with more than 10,000 people in Britain, more in common found a different story. 7 groups with different values and beliefs. The British 7. For 2 groups, politics is important. Progressive activists are cosmopolitan, opinionated, and frustrated with the injustices they see around them. They're outspoken on social media. Backbone conservatives also follow the news closely. They're patriotic and nostalgic, but also optimistic about Britain's future. The other 5 groups focus more on society than on politics. Civic pragmatists care about others at home and abroad and give generously to charities. They'd like less conflict and more compromise. Established liberals, when they look at Britain and the world, they see a lot that is good. Disengaged battlers are just getting by. The rules seem rigged against them, but they don't blame other people, they blame the system. Disengaged traditionalists think too many people are breaking the rules and taking advantage of others. A hard day's work never did anyone any harm, they say. Loyal nationals are patriotic about Britain, but worry that our way of life is threatened. They also feel our society has become more unfair. If you ask all these people what they believe, they don't always agree the way you think. On one issue, they cluster together one way. On another issue, there's a different lineup, like a kaleidoscope. And there's a surprising amount on which almost everyone agrees. The Britain's Choice Project helps us understand our differences, avoid divisions, and build upon a common ground. Join us, sign up to stay in touch, and take the quiz to see where among the British 7 you belong.
Thank you so much, Jane. That's great. And thank you for bearing with us there. I'll just share my screen again and do give me a shout to say that you can see this now.
That's great.
As soon as it comes up. Perfect. Great. Right. So that was just to give you a little overview. And here on this slide, you can now see the average distribution of the segments for 2024 as a percentage of the British population as a whole. So that's across England, Scotland, and Wales. And just to say that the segment names were formulated by More in Common in 2020, and they're aimed at encapsulating sort of the core sentiment of each segment in general, and not sort of specifically when it comes to climate change. In terms of the segmentation methodology, the segments were created entirely from questions around 5 areas of core beliefs that were drawn from social psychology. So those questions centered around group identity and tribalism, perceived threat, parenting style and authoritarianism, moral foundations, personal agency and responsibility. And no demographic information, such as gender, age, race, or class, was used to create these segments. However, the segments that were created through this process do have some demographic differences between them. And this segmentation shows that values and beliefs are powerful in influencing how individuals form opinions about issues in their behavior. And in our data, we often see that the segments are actually more predictive of certain beliefs than maybe some other metrics, such as age group or income bracket. And what I want you to take away from this today is that these segments are a tool that allows us to explore and empathize with different values and ways of seeing the world. And these heavily influence how different people think about and engage with climate change. And that's why we have to keep this in mind. Now, let's look at each of the segments a bit more in detail to get a feel for who they are. Progressive activists. Now, this segment is probably the most familiar to climate campaigners. They're a group for whom politics is an important part of their identity and to seek to correct long-standing injustices. They tend to be slightly younger, more urban, well-educated, and have quite a global outlook. They're very engaged across a range of issues, with climate change being central among them, from voting to protesting and signing petitions. People who belong to this segment are boldly progressive in their politics, and they tend to have the most left-wing views on social economic issues. And they're also consistently active in their own lives, both politically and personally, on climate change already. However, the high issue awareness of progressive activists also means that their level of optimism when looking into the future is relatively low. They see a huge need for change everywhere and not much action, especially by the big players, but also by the general public. And that means for you as communicators, when you're trying to engage progressive activists on your climate issue, you want to be sure to give them hope. Don't just stress the need for change, but also share success stories from places where this change is already happening. The second segment to look at are civic pragmatists. This segment is much more moderate. They're less politically motivated, but they are quite sort of pro-environmental at home. This is a group that cares about others, both at home and abroad, and they wish for less conflict and more compromise. Civic pragmatists are highly concerned and are the second most engaged on climate change. However, unlike progressive activists, climate change is not central to their politics, and they don't see it as exacerbating other social issues. And they're equally, if not more, concerned about other issues as well, such as the NHS, the economy, education, racism, and preserving our cultural heritage. So while the concern about climate change is prominent, it is arguably underpinned by a fairly sort of passive sense of conviction and relatively low levels of political commitment, at least. And despite being a relatively economically secure segment, they are the most likely to feel like they're helpless in the face of climate change. And so that means that when you're talking to civic pragmatists about your work, it's really important to build their sense of efficacy and confidence. Acknowledge the good environmental things that they're already doing at home and in their communities, even if they're small, and show how they can have an even greater positive impact by taking some sort of low-level political action, like speaking to their councillor or maybe signing a petition. Next up is a segment we call established liberals. These tend to be more optimistic and empowered, relatively engaged with low carbon tax solutions and green growth. They're a group that has done well and means well towards others, but they also see a lot of good at the current status quo as they've benefited from it. They tend to hold right-leaning views about the economy, but they are more left-leaning when it comes to social and cultural issues. And of all the segments, they feel the least threatened or vulnerable. They fall in the middle of the segments in terms of worry about climate change, but it's definitely not an issue that sort of incites activism among them. And their confidence and personal sense of efficacy makes established liberals quite receptive to sort of things like personal behavior change appeals, especially with a view to being early adopters of green technologies like EVs or heat pumps, for example. However, as climate isn't their main concern in the world, when you're communicating with them, you want to convince them that sustainable lifestyle choices are generally common sense and benefit them and their communities, not just environmentally, but also economically and socially. Then we've got backbone conservatives. Now, this segment tends to be slightly older and better off and well-educated. They're a group who are proud to be British. They're optimistic about Britain's future, even outside of Europe, and they keenly follow the news. In keeping with every other segment, background conservatives recognize that human activity causes climate change. They're not climate skeptics. And they do show some enthusiasm for and openness to the broad goal of living more lightly on the land and in a healthier balance between humans and nature. They're also most likely to agree that preserving the beauty of the countryside is a positive benefit of climate action. Now, background conservatives are much more likely to hold foreign governments responsible for causing climate change, and they want to see other big polluting nations take action too, not just Britain. And so when engaging with this segment on your issue, you want to lean into their pride in British achievements by emphasizing how climate action now will help preserve a British way of life and protect Cumbria's natural and cultural heritage for generations to come. Then we've got disengaged traditionalists. Now people who belong to this segment tend to feel quite alienated. They're skeptical and are some of the least engaged on climate issues. This is a group that values a well-ordered society and prides itself in hard work. They want strong leadership that keeps people in line. And disengaged traditionalists are the least likely to act on climate change in their personal lives. They're least concerned about climate change and environmental issues, and least likely to talk about climate change with their friends and family. However, they're most likely, and in the same line, they're most likely to say that they feel no emotions about climate change. And whilst they recognize sort of tangible environmental risks like air pollution, disengaged traditionalists are unlikely to respond well to the kind of messaging that marks them out as a group that is vulnerable to such threats. They're quite reluctant to see themselves in that way and tend to display a somewhat tenacious type of optimism. When engaging disengaged traditionalists on your issue, so you have to be aware that in the first instance, you're unlikely to be a trusted communicator for them. If you can, don't start the conversation by barging in right away with climate, but lead with other benefits that taking climate action can have for the lives of disengaged traditionalists, like lower bills or more energy independence. That is likely to be more successful with this segment. Next up, we've got disengaged battlers. Now, the segment we call disengaged battlers tend to skew younger and more urban, and they tend to be just getting by, really. They blame the system for its unfairness, but not other people. This segment often feels unheard in politics and society and can feel quite frustrated by middle-class environmentalism. They tend to have work, but this is often insecure or involves irregular hours. They can feel disconnected from other people, and many say that they've given up on the system altogether, and they're less connected to others in the local area and community as well. Now, compared to progressive activists and civic pragmatists, disengaged battlers are less worried about climate change and other environmental issues, but they're still more worried than some of the other segments. And so when talking about your issue with disengaged battlers, you first want to listen to their concerns and stresses about everyday life. Then try to find common ground by emphasizing how some of those inequalities can be addressed by promoting climate action. So for example, by making public transport more regular and affordable in the area that disengaged battlers live. And then finally, the seventh segment is a group that we call neonationals. This segment tends to be populist and patriotic, and they're highly concerned about local issues and not having a say in what happens. Neonationals worry that their way of life is being threatened by too many changes, and they feel that British society has become more unfair. They express the third highest level of worry about climate change, in fact, across a range of environmental issues, such as plastics, deforestation, air pollution, food waste. They're either the second or third most concerned segment. However, despite being the third most likely to say that they would sign a petition about climate change, they're very unlikely to vote based on climate policy. And they tend to think that there's no point in individual people trying to protect the environment because big companies in other countries will just keep polluting. They share feelings of victimhood and a sense of injustice, and their views, when you talk to them about personal action, can often be quite reactionary. And so this means that when you're engaging loyal nationals, it is important to show how your climate issue is relevant locally to the area where they live, and how tackling it will improve things for ordinary people and the community in general. So for example, if you could show that we can both reduce food waste and tackle poverty among local families at the same time. Now, I know this was a lot of information that I just threw at you there, but what I want you to take away from this is that the 7 segments come together and diverge around various issues and along various axes, as you can see here. So things like trust in politics and elites, whether they have a local or global outlook, whether they're motivated by global issues, and to what extent they're more optimistic or pessimistic about the state of the world. And all of these are key lines along which to think about and design climate communication and engagement strategies. So, for example, if you're raising awareness about sewage pollution with loyal nationals or disengaged battlers, you need to be aware that your call to action has to match their low trust in politics and elites. So whilst they might listen to you and agree that raw sewage is a big problem, they're unlikely to write to their MP or vote for a particular political party about it, because they simply don't believe in the efficacy of the political system as it stands, and they don't think this will make any difference. Another example would be if you're trying to talk to established liberals or progressive activists about switching to heat pumps, you really want to be sure to emphasize how this individual action connects the wider shifts in heating habits across Cumbria, the UK, and in other countries based on being motivated by global issues. Again, these are just a few very short examples, but this is the kind of thing that we would explore further in an interactive workshop to work out what this means for you, your target audience, and the specific issues that you're working on. Now, segmentation helps us to think through how our comms and engagement could be received by others who have legitimately very different worldviews from us. And so, as I said before, is a tool for empathetic communication and engagement. And whilst there is no one-size-fits-all approach, there's plenty of common ground across the segments as well, as you can see here. So we did some polling earlier this year where we asked a large representative sample of British adults which impacts of climate change they were most worried about over the next 10 years. And from a list of 15 options, they could select up to 3. And as you can see here, across all 7 segments, except for disengaged traditionalists, people are mostly worried about climate change harming nature and wildlife. Now, from other research we've done, we also know that it's much more effective to talk about nature at the local level and to emphasize respect and care for our countryside. So with this type of information, you then know how to start. You have an effective sort of starting point if you want to talk to a broader audience, or if you simply want to have a conversation with local residents and really start building some common ground. Again, this is just a brief data point, but based on the many insights we have and the comms and engagement challenges that you and your organizations face, in an in-depth workshop, we can help you design your comms in a way that really speaks to people beyond your own bubble and in a language that they will understand, that they will connect with and find meaningful. All right, and with that, I will hand back to Karen.
Thank you, Louisa. We've just got a bit of time now for Q&A. So there was a lot of information I'm aware that Louisa was sharing with us there, all of which is really fascinating. Any questions for Louisa? Now is your opportunity to raise them. So we have a question from Charlie. How would you know which group, which of those segments people identify with?
Yeah, thank you. I don't want to spoil too much of the second part of this webinar, I don't think. But essentially, when you get to know the segments and sort of the values that they hold, there are some questions you can ask, sort of even in just day-to-day conversation, that give you some clues as to what worldview or values they might hold and which segments they belong to. It's not an exact science, however, I will say that. So people are most likely to belong to one of these segments, but that doesn't mean that they definitely don't belong in any of the others. Rather, it's a way of changing perspective and understanding where some people might be coming from and their logic of seeing the world and how climate action fits into that. But I think in terms of how to identify those segments and where they might be, watch this space, and Bridget will talk a lot more about that in a minute.
Okay, thank you. We have a question. So Sally asking, is she right in interpreting some of this as a huge impact from David Attenborough TV programs?
Thank you. Yes, so we've personally at Climate Outreach not done a lot of research sort of testing like nature programs, especially those by David Attenborough, but I think there's a lot of data that we know from the climate movement more generally and the cultural industries that David Attenborough is quite a trusted communicator. I mean, we know that much among the segments that people from almost every segment can identify with him and sort of look up to him. In terms of the exact effect those programs have had, it's kind of hard to tell, but they definitely play a big part in making climate and nature and the environment sort of relevant to people's lives, and as sort of an entertainment format, they're more likely to engage with this kind of stuff, even if they're not very politically motivated as well.
Thank you. There's been a question about the slides. The slides are amazing. Can we have access to them? And yes, I can confirm that we'll be sending the slides out to participants after the event. We've got a question from Julia. Can you recommend any strategies to address a group of mixed people, so people from a variety of segmentations?
Yes, so I think that would really depend on which segments are most relevant to you. If you're trying to speak to all 7 of them, that's not the easiest thing to do, but I recognize sometimes you have to. So I think in that instance, it's really good to start with things that everyone cares about. So these tend to be more environmental issues rather than climate per se. So things like sewage pollution, air pollution, protecting local wildlife habitats, things like that tend to be quite good entry points that people from across the 7 segments agree need to happen. And then I think you probably want to listen to what people say in response first before you then sort of launch in with your next point, to understand kind of where they might stand on climate issues more specifically, or your issue that you want to engage them on.
Thank you, Louisa. A question from John asking about your mention of demographics. Do demographics affect the ways in which some of the segments respond to different climate messages?
Yeah, thanks, John. They definitely have an effect, but if you look at the effect size between the segment you belong to and your age, then the segment you belong to has a much bigger effect in how you react to different messages than your age does. So because we use the 7 segments largely as a lens, we don't do detailed research into how, say, 16 to 24-year-olds react to a certain message compared to 54 to 65-year-olds. I would kind of say that you can go with your gut on a few of those things. And if you're unsure, then I would definitely try and test some messages according to different age groups, just with a few people from that age group. If you don't have them represented in whoever is designing your communication strategies, that would probably be my first suggestion.
Okay. We have a point from Emma. Are there particular organizations or people that the different segments trust more or listen to more on climate messages?
Yeah, thank you. So I recently just finished a big project on trust and influence in climate comms, and to what extent what makes messengers trusted. And there are quite common themes across the different segments. However, there are also differences between the segments, and I can put the report in the chat. We just published it just last month to look at the different segments. I don't think so. For example, you might think, the National Trust tends to be quite trusted by someone like backbone conservatives, and maybe someone who's a more activist climate group tends to be more trusted by progressive activists, which I think is sort of quite obvious. I think it gets more interesting and more nuanced when you really look at kind of what makes individual people trusted, and to what extent influencers can actually persuade people, even if they don't have a connection to those people. And what we found in our research project is actually that people don't react very well to influencers just sort of being slapped on some kind of climate message if they've nothing to do with it. So I think that personal connection, that motivation, oh, why are they talking about this? Why would they speak up on something like this is really important. And so I think when it comes to finding trusted messengers, if you yourself don't think you are a trusted messenger, which you might legitimately not be for the audience you're trying to engage, the best thing to do is, to really just look at the channels that segment is already listening to. There's more information on all of the segments out there, both on the more uncommon sides and on our online toolkit, and then kind of go from there and test a little bit.
Thank you. Is there a question from Jilly? Is there a lowest common denominator within the segment? So would targeting disengaged battlers and using the messaging that works for them also speak to the progressive activists? And would it therefore help to cover more segments by using that kind of strategy, optimizing our limited resources?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think it really depends on what it is you're trying to do. So if you want to show that, people care about climate action in Cumbria, which is a very sort of broad, can mean a lot of things kind of goal, but, equally important politically to kind of emphasize that this is a widespread concern, then you might want to do that sort of, lowest common denominator messaging that's essentially, act now to preserve Cumbria for generations to come, or something like this, right? However, if you're trying to engage people and communicate with them in order to get them to take, say, very specific political action, then that is unlikely to work, because saying something like this won't make progressive activists say, okay, great, we're now going to hold a rally in this place, right? So I think it really depends on what your communication is intended to do, to whether you need to be really specific and targeted to sort of incite action with that audience, or whether you're more interested in just showing like a broader coalition of concern.
And a slightly related question from Joe, sort of asking, doesn't almost everyone respond to messages on health? Did that come through your research?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, health is, it's great because everyone can relate to it. And it feels very personally relevant. I think that the climate issue has kind of suffered from this so what a lot, and especially people who have very immediate concerns can relate to it much better through health. I would say though that, we all know that, tobacco warning doesn't stop anyone from, necessarily from smoking, even though the health, detriment is right there on the packaging. So I think it's a great way to start conversations about climate, but it's not really a panacea for saying, oh, extreme heat is going to impact this many people, therefore we need to take climate action, and expect people to just then say like, oh yes, of course, sign me up. I think that's, just to keep in mind.
Time for maybe just one more question from Mike. Are there any ready-to-use tools to capture priorities? And that you've mentioned 16 topics.
Can I just check, is this in relation to the table that I showed, where I was talking about the 15 answer options that people could pick?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
So in terms of ready-to-use tools to capture priorities, and apologies if I'm misunderstanding the question, if you're trying to find out what the priorities are of your audience, you can go onto our website and look at the graphs, and you can find sort of the questions we asked there. And if it's not in the written up report, then you can definitely get in touch and ask for the survey questions that we asked, in particular if you're interested in that kind of thing.
Okay, lovely. One last question from Bill about nature and wildlife seeming to be high on a priority issue for most of the groups, and what's the best way to exploit this as a way to engage them with climate change action? Quite a big question, that one.
Yes, that's correct. It is a high priority issue for many people, and I think the best way to exploit this is really to start by talking about that and not sort of just say a sentence about it and then barge in with climate again, or net zero. I think, you know, people are worried about the impact of climate change on wildlife and nature, because there's a slightly romanticized idea and quite sort of, you know, that innocence that they've done nothing to deserve this or to contribute to climate change, but are now bearing the brunt of this. And so I think if you want to exploit this, in a sense, it would be really helpful to sort of partner maybe with local wildlife organizations, to maybe do events together so that people see the overlap between kind of nature conservation and climate and start to connect these things. I wouldn't too quickly, like I said, jump in with your own thing, but really make sure that what you're trying to do is contributing to protecting wildlife and nature in the UK, and, you know, help people through coalitions, through events together, through communications that are aligned, to show that, you know, fighting the climate crisis and also helps with the nature and biodiversity crisis.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Louisa. There's a final question from Ali. If you could just have a look at that, perhaps when Bridget's presenting, and answer that in the chat, that would be great. Just before we move on to Bridget, this second half of the event is focusing down on segmentation in relation to Cumbria. So the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership commissioned CSE to apply the segmentation and to provide us with some mapping so that we can see where these segments are most kind of prevalent in Cumbria. And that's what Bridget is now going to share with us. So over to you, Bridget.
Thank you. Just got to remember to unmute. So I'm Bridget Newbury. I'm from the Centre for Sustainable Energy, which is an energy charity. We're based in Bristol, but we operate across the country, and we actually do some projects that are outside the UK. And our mission is addressing the climate emergency and fuel poverty. We've been around for a bit more than 40 years now. We work across three main teams. We have a home energy team working with individuals to make their homes greener and their bills more affordable. We have a communities team where I work, which works with community organisations and local councils, and a research team who carry out research and analysis focusing on making the energy system fairer, smarter, and less carbon intensive. And at any one time, we've got 40 or 50 projects running, which collectively give us some knowledge and experience and policy insights, which we can then share. And just recently, we've been working quite a lot with climate outreach on communication and behaviour change, which is how this session came about. So you can see how those insights that Louisa was sharing about the British segments can really help to understand where people are coming from, what might motivate them to change their behaviours. We know that any segmentation approach is more useful if you can see how the people belonging to each segment are geographically distributed. So to make it possible to map the British segments, we used Experian Mosaic data, which is a market segmentation tool. It's the thing that most of the marketing companies use when they're deciding who to send their catalogues to and what offers to promote to which postcode areas. It's got 89 categories of people identified across 15 main groups, and crucially goes down to the level of individual postcodes. So we matched the more in common questions which are used in Won't Talks Climate with the Experian Mosaic characteristics to get the closest possible match to the British segments for every household. And what that means is that you can put the segments on a map and you can look at the different geographies or scales. In the data that we've shared with Zero Carbon Cumbria, the segments are broken down by output area, lower super output area, ward and parish. I'll come back and explain those in a sec. But it means that you can look at the best place to target for specific initiatives or campaigns, and also who the people are in a given area and how to use messaging which they're more likely to act on. So just explain those geographies a minute. Once you've linked the British segments to address data, the data can be cut up in different ways depending on what geography you're used to working at. We're concentrating here on lower super output areas and wards. Now, you'll be familiar with wards because of elections and voting, and you probably know, or you're sure to know, which ward you live in. There are 79 wards in Cumbria, and each ward has an average of 6,300 people. But the problem with wards is they can vary quite hugely in size. So for census data, households are grouped by output areas, where MSOA, middle layer super output area, is the largest, then LSOA, lower level, and then output area is the smallest. So looking at LSOAs, lower level super output areas, the average number of households is about 800, 798 to be precise. So as I go through this data, bear in mind the LSOA are chunks of about 800 households, whereas wards are more like 6,500 people. So going back to Louisa's slides showing the percentage of the British population and how they are spread out, you can compare that then across the whole of Cumbria and see how it's different to the national picture. So compared to the general population, I'll flip between these a minute, the main differences are that there are more disengaged battlers. So this dark red chunk here for Cumbria is about 30% of households, compared to 8% of the British population. And there are also, sadly, far fewer progressive activists. So that tiny sliver at the top there in yellow, there's less than 1% in Cumbria compared to 8% or so of the British population. The other segments aren't so different. There are slightly fewer civic pragmatists in Cumbria. There are basically the same number of established liberals, slightly fewer backbone conservatives, slightly fewer disengaged traditionalists, and roughly the same percentage of loyal nationals. So you can see across the whole who we're talking to. Then obviously, once you've linked the segments to addresses, you can put them on a map like this, and that gives you another view. This map shows you the lowest super output areas, and for each LSOA, the largest number of households in that area that are linked to a segment. So the color codes here show the lowest super output areas color coded with the segment which is most dominant. So a bit like a political map, it doesn't mean that everyone in an orange area is a disengaged traditionalist, but it does mean that there are more disengaged traditionalist households in the orange areas than households represented by any other segment. And then you can also look at each individual segment and see whereabouts the households belonging to the segments are. So there's a Cumbria LSOA map for each of the 7 British segments. And because we've also got the data at ward level, I'll talk you through the LSOA maps, but I'll give a little bit more detail as we run through. So I'll start with the established liberals on this map here. The number in the top left there is the estimated number of households that are linked to this segment. You can see there are a lot of established liberals in the rural LSOAs, which are larger in size and have lower population density. So it actually looks in the map above as though they cover the whole of Cumbria, but that's because of the size of the wards and LSOA areas. It's 14% of the population of the households altogether. And it's also the dominant segment in 19 of the wards. And there are 6 wards where established liberals represent a majority. Progressive activists, this is your very, very tiny sliver. And the reason this map looks empty is because those 368 households don't actually manage to make more than 10% of the households in any of the LSOA areas. Civic pragmatists, 24,000 households, about 10% of the households across Cumbria. You can see there are some darker places where the individual LSOAs have quite high numbers of civic pragmatists. But when you look at ward level, there's only one ward, Cockermouth South, where this segment represents the highest number of households. Then you've got your disengaged battlers, which for Cumbria is the biggest segment, a bit more than 75,000 households. They're also the most dominant segment in 37 wards, and there are 3 wards where more than 60% of households are disengaged battlers. In many of those LSO areas where there's large number of people living in small areas, you've got disengaged battlers, so it looks disproportionately small on a map like this, which is more to do with the locations than the numbers. The Loyal Nationals, this is your second biggest group in Cumbria, almost 56,000 households. They're the dominant segment in 12 wards. There are quite a few LSOA areas where they represent more than 50% of households. Disengaged traditionalists, this is a bit more, well, almost 22,000 households, again, 9%. And as you can see on the map, there are some high concentrations within individual LSOAs, but at ward level, there are no wards where this is the dominant segment overall. Then your backbone conservatives, last but not least, just under 41,000 households, or 16% of households. And you can see here at the LSOA level, there are some quite high densities. There are also 10 wards where overall this is the most dominant segment. So look, putting the data on maps gives you a slightly different picture. When you drill down into the data, you can start to see things like for backbone conservatives, there are 4 wards where there's no other segment representing more than 20% of households. You can see the data in different ways. So going back to the numbers again, as opposed to looking at this, which is the kind of the donut chart, as opposed to the numbers of the locations of the households and the different segments. You can look at the data at LSOA level like this, where disengaged battlers represent the most popular segment for 44% of the LSOAs. And again, a reminder, that doesn't mean all the people living there are in that segment, but that segment represents more people than any other segment for that area. And this is a similar thing, just cutting it up by wards instead, where again, disengaged battlers are still the biggest group with 47% of wards dominated. You can see from here, there's only 1 ward which is dominated by civic pragmatists, the pink one there, and no progressive activists. Within wards, the most popular segment might represent the vast majority of households, or it might be a majority, but only just, so with several other segments also taking a large account of the population. And if you can understand that split, that will very much affect how you use the BTC messaging. So looking at Cumbria, there are 17 wards that have a very dominant, most popular segment. 53 wards have 2 dominant segments, and there are 9 which are more evenly spread out. So obviously, in wards where 1 segment represents a very high proportion of households, say more than 60%, you can probably go in quite strongly with messaging that will talk to that segment in particular. But if you know that your area, whether you're looking at ward or you're going smaller to the LSOA, if you know that there's a more even split, you might have to step back a bit and do more of that lowest common denominator messaging. So the really useful thing you can do with a bit more time to analyze the data is to look at the exact split within a given ward, or to compare different wards or different geographies. And the split within each ward is really quite different. It's quite interesting when you start to play around. So we've shared, as Karen said, we've shared the full data set with Zero Carbon Cumbria. It means you can go in, look at any given ward and see what the segment distribution is. So this is an example of ward level breakdown. And then when you can see this breakdown, you can really start to tailor your messaging. So here, you've obviously got a lot more established Liberals than any other segment. So you can start to think, what are the things that will be more meaningful for those people. And move on. So it's a lot to take in, I know. And it just, you start to think about, you know, what that means in some wards where if you've got a most popular segment that's 30% of households, but you might also have two other segments representing 25%, you can go quite hard on those three groups. Or again, you know, if there's one dominant group, you can talk to those people. But also when you're talking about or thinking about introducing a scheme or campaigning on a particular message, you can see where the people are that you might want to talk to first or get on board. So there's different ways you can apply it. I will just run through some example use cases of the sorts of things you might choose to use it for. This is examples only. So, for example, you could use it to promote recycling in areas where there are poor levels of recycling. You can use it to target the places or the postcode areas where people are more likely to go for self-funded solar PV scheme or for funded home energy efficiency schemes. You can look at boosting take-up of public transport. You can look at diversifying the number of people visiting national parks, or you could do things like identifying where the highest concentrations of progressive activists, civic pragmatists, and established liberals are to get the higher concentrations of people more likely to take positive climate action to get a thing moving and off the ground. So I was also going to just talk a little bit about who else is doing this already. There's a film which we will share from Eco Birmingham. This is Simon Slater, who's the director of Eco Birmingham, who we mapped the segments across Birmingham and shared it with them. They were in the middle of doing some work on their communications, and it made them completely rethink how they spoke to the people they were trying to reach out, because they basically realized there was a real mismatch, not least in what they were saying, but also in the fact that people they were trying to reach were not going to be very receptive to messages from an organisation called Eco Birmingham. You know, they saw them as green hippies and weren't going to be listening to them. So they used the British segments to just rethink how they spoke to their stakeholders. In Bristol, there's a citywide climate communications group, which is council officers and local and community groups, community of vulnerable sector groups, and also a couple of the universities are involved. And they have been holding regular meetings using the British segments and just thinking about how they can apply those to different schemes and initiatives that are being rolled out by different organisations and by the council. North Somerset have just got some funding just this last couple of weeks actually to do some work on using the segments to target two specific wards in the North Somerset area to promote a solar PV scheme, and also just generally try to get people to put more solar on their houses. So it's combining this data with data about where the people who are most likely to be able to pay for solar panels live, and then get some targeted message out to those two wards. And in Birmingham, they used, again, this segmentation data together with some other data sets to target new transport initiatives and the British segment specifically on communicating some of their existing work, including schools and food and waste projects. So in terms of taking this stuff forwards, you can start to just think about the different segments, the different messages, kind of different take on things when you're having conversations, when you're deciding what wording to use in leaflets or on websites and surveys, when you're looking for specific areas to target for funding or support, or if you're planning some new projects, new low carbon infrastructure or initiatives where you want to promote positive climate action and get more local buy-in. Although I will say it's absolutely not intended as a replacement for people on the ground and local community development workers and speaking to people. This is it's a tool to help things along rather than a replacement for any of that vital work. So what we'd really like to do is run an in-person workshop with you where we can discuss the British segments in more detail, go into some of the theories of behaviour change, share that data, be able to physically look up different wards and LSOAs and discuss how you could tailor messaging for the different things you're working on and the different people you're working with. But hopefully these slides, those maps, the data will give you a flavour of that. And I would strongly recommend using the Britain Talks Climate Toolkit, looking at the more in-depth research from Climate Outreach on the website, and if it's appropriate, dipping into the different CSE resources, things like Solar Wizard and our carbon footprinting tool, and so on. Yeah, I will finish up there. Maybe we'll go on to some questions.
Bridget, you're well within time, which is great. I just wondered whether you wanted to play the Eco Birmingham video.
Let's try it.
I'm Slater. I work for an organisation called Eco Birmingham, a small charity working communities and individuals across Birmingham. We have used the Britain Talks climate material initially. We were using it to focus on targeting some of our services in different bits of Birmingham, but it's actually fundamentally changed the way we're delivering our services. The reason it's changed that is because our mission is to influence about 25% of the population of Birmingham in the next 10 years to undertake environmental actions, and that causes a ripple effect to more people joining in. What the Britain Talks climate work showed us is that actually only about 9% of Birmingham's in that category at the moment, and it tends to be people we're already talking to. It tends to be where the environmental groups are generally based. The other fundamental changes it's given us is it's given the majority of the environmental organisations in Birmingham the actual evidence to confirm what we already knew. We were predominantly working with people we already got this agenda in particular parts of the city, and we were being quite naive about how we were going to reach other parts of the city without understanding what the local messaging should be, what working with local partners should be, and actually the different areas of the city had different needs. So that's quite a challenge for our sector, and it's really useful holding us, I suppose, mirror up to us in terms of Birmingham. This is what the city needs rather than what we think it needs.
Thank you for that, Bridget. We do have a question. It might be useful if you could go back to keep your presentation up and go back to the LSOA main map. Just a point of clarification. The green, you had a map up where the majority of the county was green, and I can't remember which segmentation that is, but the question is, that seemed huge compared to the percentage pie chart you showed earlier. So if we could just whiz back and just go through again what the difference is in terms of, you know, how that colouring shows on the bigger map of Cumbria.
I can definitely do that. So this is to do with the geography. So the idea that you can have an LSOA area that's quite small but has a large number of people in it, which is the case for lots of these dark browny red wards, which are the disengaged battlers. And these wards, the more rural areas where there's more established liberals, they tend to be larger areas with more dispersed population. So it's to do with that kind of the more urban versus the more rural areas. So it's that thing around it, looking at different views of the data gives you very different, it shows different things. This is one, this is the big map for the established liberals. So you can see, you can also, if I go right down, oh, it doesn't come out very well on here. with these slides will be shared, but what I could also do is share the PDF versions of the maps where you can see the boundaries of in this case, the LSOAs more clearly. But you can see those are all quite large areas, whereas if we go to the disengaged battlers, you can see that these areas are quite small. And so it's this is a greater number of people compared to these larger geographies. I hope does that make sense?
I think the devil's in the detail.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And when you start to look at the the spreadsheets and the breakdown, you can see that picture a bit more. And it's also, I talked quite a lot about the percentage breakdowns between wards and LSOAs, but it's also to do with the number of people. So in one smaller geography, you can have a large majority that actually represents a smaller number of people than the minority group in a different ward. So it's details and numbers.
Right. Okay. I just want to pop back to a question that actually came up sort of as Louisa was finishing up her Q&A, which is the point made about one of the big impacts of climate change being on food availability, and whether that was a factor that has been considered or has come up in the research, or is perhaps a hook for messaging.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. So from our focus groups and some of the polling that we've done, we know that people are concerned about kind of climate change impacting food availability and production in the UK, but they see it very much as a future problem, which debatably isn't, but that's how people perceive of it at the moment. So in comparison to other sort of more immediate issues like the cost of living crisis or the state of the NHS, they're not going to be as galvanized by those issues, if you will, just because for them they think they're more a future problem than a now problem. However, if you are talking to people who work in the farming or for production sectors, I think they are more engaged with probably what's going on already, and for them this could be a good kind of frame or way to start the conversation. So I guess again, kind of depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah. I just want to also acknowledge Bill's comment about, from his perspective as a conservation grazier, where using cattle and sheep to graze wildlife sites for nature conservation can often be pitted against climate change because of methane emissions from livestock. So there's all these sort of complexities around messaging. As you were speaking, Bridget, Hannah was very keen to see Barrow. I think it was just slightly dropping off the bottom of your maps, but we will be sharing the slides with everybody, so you will be able to see Barrow and how that sort of is flagged when it comes to the segments. We've answered the question about the green on the map. There was a question about whether it's possible to have this kind of analysis done for other areas.
Yep. Because we've got the methodology for mapping the more in common questions that are used for the segments against the Mosaic Experian data, it can be done. And I think that we've paid for the Experian data for the whole country. So it's a matter of, doing the modelling again and producing the spreadsheets, generating the maps, but it can in theory be done for the whole country.
Right.
But Barrow, what's the ward that's covered? I can show you the breakdown specifically.
Anybody know a ward name for Barrow? Perhaps if Hannah could pop a suggestion in the chat, we'd come back to that. In the meantime, Kate, making the point that I think has amazed perhaps all of us, were you surprised at the lack of progressive activists in Cumbria? And why do you think this is?
Yes, and it's a really good question. And I think it's because in order to map the data, we've used this Experian Mosaic data, which is households, whereas Britain Talks Climate is based on individuals. And it's more likely that that group will be the kind of probably a bit younger, possibly more left-wing, and less likely to own a house or be head of a household. Whereas the people who the Xperia Mosaic are writing there are using for people to write their letters to, promoting their stuff. That talks to the household level. So I think that's the difference. So it may not be as bleak as it seems from those charts where you've got the tiny less than 1% of households being linked to that segment. It's probably that there are a lot more of those people represented in Cumbria, but they're not the household kind of lead.
Kate makes the point they're probably all on this call. I think quite a high percentage of
Yeah,
the progressive activists
yeah,
may well be on this
probably
call.
a quarter of, yeah.
So, but it sounds as though there is a little bit of caution around the stats. Is that caution, does that relate just to that group, the progressive activists, or are there some other kind of considerations in how the data's been derived that we just need to be a little bit aware of?
So we also talked about how Cumbria probably has a lot more second homeowners than many other parts of the country, and how that will also slightly skew the data because the person who owns the home will be represented rather than the people staying in the home. But I think, there's a note of caution across all of this, that it's a tool, it's really not absolute, and almost guaranteed if you take it to a street and say, oh, you're all disengaged battlers in this area, they won't all be disengaged battlers. And even within the segments, people are kind of more strongly affiliated with one of those segments. But they'll have, as with any archetype, it's a kind of closest match defining the general characteristics with that group. So there will always be places where it's not quite right, but it's a thing that we've got that can take our conversations a bit further than if we didn't have this as a tool to work with.
Great message. So we've now got some suggestions for wards in Barrow. We've got a long list, actually. It's probably best if you have a look at that, Bridget. Is there anything you can work on with that list? Just
I'm going to
quickly show.
I'm going to share my my screen with you here. So what have we got? Oh wow. Okay. So let me make this slightly bigger so you can see. So this is just I've got a drop down here. So if we've got Barrow Island, Barrow Inverness, can't see those as actual ward names. Central Barrow. Let's try Dalton. Here we go, Dalton North and Dalton South. So it kind of gives you, this is the sort of thing that we could do in the workshop. We can start to actually look. So this is Dalton South, Dalton North, sorry, where this is quite representative of Cumbria, I'd say, with 991 households linked to disengaged battlers, 771 backbone conservatives, then loyal nationals, civic pragmatists, a few established liberals, and not very many disengaged households. We compare that to Dalton South. So that's there. Oh, so this is interesting. So if you were mapping this against the segment that was the most populous, it would show you that loyal nationals have the most populous segment, but by literally one household. So that's the reason for doing this kind of breakdown when you're drilling down. So if you were messaging people in this ward, you could talk quite strongly to those two groups, disengaged battlers and loyal nationals. And you could start thinking about some of those things Louisa was talking about, the things that would appeal to those groups. You could go quite hard on those. And the rest of the groupings are fairly small. I do one more just so you can get the idea. So what we've got at the bottom, Warney South. Oh, Walney Island. Let's see if that's the one. So similar picture here for Walney Island. The one I mentioned Cockermouth earlier on, so the south. So even here between Cockermouth North and Cockermouth South. So this is the one place in the whole of Cumbria where you've got more civic pragmatists than anywhere else, which is one of the segments that is probably a bit easier to engage with on some of these issues. Anyway, you do start to get the idea. Do you want me to do a few more, or that probably gives a picture?
I think that's helpful, and it sort of leads on to a question from Kate about will we be able to have access to the ward level breakdowns? And I think it would just be helpful if perhaps you could talk a little bit in relation to the workshop that's proposed, and we will be just hoping that people will stay on with us just for a little bit longer so that we can send out some questions for you to complete as a poll before you leave the call, so that we can gauge interest in the more detailed workshop that Bridget and Louisa have mentioned. But Bridget, do you just want to explain how
Sure. Well, Zero
that
Carbon
data will be
Cumbria
made available?
You've paid for the data, so it's up to you if you want to share that more widely or not. And there's different things you could do with, in North Somerset, one of the things they've done is taken ward by ward and actually started to look at comms plans for each ward, but using those breakdowns. And that's certainly something you could do. In the workshops, we would have that spreadsheet on a number of laptops so you can look them up and have the maps so you can zoom in and out and actually start to say, if you were doing a scheme in Cockermouth where you were trying to get more people to use public transport, what would the sorts of things be that you could include in your comms? And then an expert from Climate Outreach can kind of give you that feedback and say, yeah, absolutely, those things would resonate with that group and that collection of people. Whereas if you're saying these other things, that might, you might not quite be hitting the mark based on our research. So it's just that kind of actually putting it into action and exploring what things might work best for a given scenario, a given initiative in a certain place, or a broader thing across a larger area.
Fabulous, thank you, Bridget. And another sort of technical question from Sonia. You talked about the results being based on homeowner responses. So were these results based on a sample survey?
So I think the more in common, the questions that got to the Britain Talks Climate and the British segments, that's based on the survey. And the Experian data takes from a lot of different sources. They use, household income, and they use a lot of different data sets to build up that picture of the Experian mosaic archetypes and profiles. And I can put a link into Experian Mosaic so you can see where that comes from, if that's useful.
Great, thank you. That would be great, thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat, so thank you everybody for being engaged. But before you all go, I just want to say a huge thank you to our presenters, to Jane and colleagues for pulling this together. I hope it's been useful. We'll look at the responses to the poll and the level of interest for a further more detailed workshop. And in the meantime, I think a colleague of mine, Hazel, is keen to promote some training that we're offering. So do look out in the chat before you go from a message about Fresk training, which is a great opportunity to really get to grips with so a brilliant new way, an interactive way of fully understanding some of the complexities of climate change in order to help us communicate what's happening better to those who aren't perhaps progressive activists quite yet. So no further ado, but thank you so much to everybody, and thank you for helping us keep it to time. Brilliant.